Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us for this roundtable we're having at NCPH. I'd like to thank you all, of course, first for coming and joining our roundtable and hearing us today. Just as an FYI, this panel is being recorded, so if you would prefer not to appear on the video, please do just keep your camera off for the remainder of the session. First, I'd just like to go over just a quick outline of what we'll be discussing today. As a roundtable, we'll be discussing two questions with regard to documentary editing and its intersection with public history. We would really welcome any comments or questions from the audience. In order to ask any questions, I'd ask that you either raise your hand, which you can do by going down to the bottom of your screen. There's a little reactions feature, and you can raise your hand there, and that'll signify to us, the presenters, that you have a question that you'd like to ask verbally. Otherwise, aside from that, you're also welcome to, of course, type messages into the chat and ask us questions that way. So what we have gathered today, we have a plan for about 30 minutes at the end of the session for full questions, but if anyone has any questions in the meantime or anything that they'd like to have clarified, we're happy to kind of answer those as we go along as well. So in terms of our roundtable here today, we have assembled 6 fabulous documentary editors from various projects around the country to talk about public history and how it intersects with their own work. So the first thing that I'd like to do, of course, is introduce what exactly documentary editing is. So I think the most fun way to define public history and, well, documentary editing, I should say, is that it's about reading other people's mail. And what I mean by that is that we take a corpus of letters. They may be related to a specific person. In my case, it's our 8th president, President Martin Van Buren, or it could be a family, as in the Adams family, or it could be a whole group of people, as we'll hear from with the Kentucky Governor's Project. And so in doing that, in reading those letters, it's then our job to transcribe those letters and make those transcriptions available to the public and scholars at large, for them to, take their own spin on it. And we do that in a couple different ways. We do that through online websites where you can go and search and read the letters of President James Madison or Dolly Madison or anyone else. And we also do it through the form of books that, are, I'm sure, available at your local library. So with doing that, we also put our own kind of editorial spin on it. That's why we're called documentary editors. So we'll explain in the course of transcribing those letters references that might not make sense to a modern reader, or references to other letters. So if I were to read a letter that said, "Dear Mr. Gilpin," it would be my job to explain to the reader who Mr. Gilpin is and why it's important that my subject is writing a letter to him. And that's kind of an opportunity for us to, interpret the document in the same way that a public historian or a curator might interpret an object within their own museum collection. But of course, we'll talk about that a lot more as our roundtable goes on. So now, given that we have just, the briefest definition from me about what documentary editing is, I'd like to start the roundtable by going around as a group as we answer our first question. So these questions are available in the description for the panel presentation you can see on Feedloop. But the first question is, can we consider documentary editing as a form of and/or as a tool for doing public history? So in opening up this roundtable, first, I'd like to ask Gwen Fries if you could unmute yourself and give us your thoughts, and also introduce yourself as well.
Hi, everyone. As Katie just said, my name is Gwen Fries. I'm the production editor for the Adams Papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society. The Adams Papers editorial project was founded in 1954. We're one of the older projects. And it was conceived as an edition that would cover 3 generations of the Adams family of Massachusetts. So we really have 3 main power couples. We have John and Abigail, John Quincy and Louisa Catherine, And then we have the diplomat Charles Francis Adams and his wife, Abigail Brooks Adams. So our work starts with John Adams' earliest writings when he's a lawyer before he becomes somebody on the national stage. And they'll hopefully go all the way through until 1889, which is when Abigail Brooks Adams passes away. With our current workflow, we are able to produce one letterpress volume a year, and we are able to upload one volume to our digital edition every year. So outside of publishing our volumes, we're really interested in engaging the public and letting them know all about the Adams papers. We're big Adams fans, and we want everyone else to be that way too. We do this by tweeting, #AdamsPapers, check it out. We blog, we hold transcribathons. Every year for John Quincy Adams' birthday, we hold a transcribathon. We have cake with his face on it. We sing happy birthday to him. And it's just a really neat experience every year to see, high schoolers sitting at a table with someone long since retired, and they're reading his diary, talking about something that happened 200 years ago and laughing together about how he phrased it. It's really, really special. We also partner with the Society's Center for the Teaching of History to hold teacher workshops. And we brainstorm ideas of how they can take the resources that we have into K through 12 classrooms. A really cool thing we do is on key anniversaries, we launch year-long celebrations or examinations of the Adamses. So we had JQA 250 for his 250th birthday. And more recently, we had Remember Abigail. And that was really interesting because we really wanted people to see Abigail besides the 3 words, remember the ladies. That's kind of what her legacy has been boiled down to. And we wanted people to know that there's so much more to Abigail. So for that, we partnered with local colleges, churches, visitor centers, heritage trails, libraries, and we started some buzz on social media. We planned pop-up exhibits. We gave gallery talks. We designed walking tours. We curated reading lists. And my personal favorite, we hosted Abigail's All-Stars, which was a March Madness style bracket where Abigail fans from all over the world got to vote on their favorite Abigail Adams quote. And if you're curious, the winner was, "We should have learned women." Our efforts garner interest from school children to senior citizens, and they reflect our commitment to making our resources available and widely used. We have a fantastic collection. The family did such a good job of preserving all of their documents, and it's really important to us that we share them with the world because the Adams family descendants entrusted us to share that message. So that's very important to us. Collaboration is essential in all we do, as I mentioned. And we also field usually about 100. I think this year it's going to be well over 100 since everyone's in their house just wondering about the Adamses, reference questions. And they come from amateur genealogists. They come from authors of children's books, National History Day students. You might get an email from a 5th grader who said, "I have to write a paper about Abigail Adams. Can you help me?" And first of all, I'm impressed that you found our editorial project. So yeah, I would go to the moon for you. And then we have people who are like, this was actually a reference question I got. They said, "I want to know where Abigail bought this piece of paper that she wrote this letter on." Well, we are willing to help, and we will do the legwork and help you out because that is really important to us. So I would say the level of engagement we get, I would say that makes us a public historians. And at very least, our volumes are a really powerful tool for public historians because the Adamses, there were elderly Adamses, there were 4-year-old Adamses talking about different things, talking about their worlds. They traveled the whole world. And they talked about music in the early American Republic. They talked about medicine. Whatever you can come up with, the Adamses have said something about it. We actually just recently held a Twitter event where people sent us an emoji and we found a corresponding quote. And I have to say, we weren't sweating it. They said something about absolutely everything. So yes, I would say what we do should qualify as public history.
Thank you so much, Gwen. We'll move on to our second presenter, Matt Godfrey. If you could go ahead and unmute yourself and then introduce yourself and kind of give us your thoughts as well.
Thanks, Katie. Gwen, that was great. I really enjoyed hearing about some of those things that you're doing with the Adams papers. So my name's Matt Godfrey. I'm a general editor and the managing historian of the Joseph Smith Papers Project. And this is a documentary editing project that has been going on since about 2001. And it's an attempt to publish a comprehensive edition in print and online of the papers of Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as the Mormon Church. And it's a project that I've been working on for about 10.5 years now. It's been a wonderful project to work on. My background is in public history. I got my PhD at Washington State University, and one of my primary fields for my PhD was public history, studying with Orland Svingen. I then spent about 8.5 years of my career as a historical consultant, working for Historical Research Associates, headquartered in Missoula, Montana. And then after that came to the Joseph Smith Papers. And it was interesting for me because when I started working for the Joseph Smith Papers, as a public historian, I felt, that there was no real difficult transition to documentary editing. I felt that it was very well in line with what I had already been doing as a public historian. And one of the fortunate things that we have with the Joseph Smith Papers is because he was the founding prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ, we have a large interested general public in the project. And there are a few ways that we can show how interested general church members are in this project. The very first print volume that we published, which was the first volume in our journals series, so a collection of Joseph Smith's journals from 1832 to 1838, sold over 60,000 copies, which was incredible. But it kind of shows how much interest there was from the general public. Now, most of the ways that we engage with the public come through our website. We have a project website, and let me just share my screen to bring that up. So this is our Joseph Smith Papers website, and much of what we've done with this website is to construct it with the public in mind, because we realize that our print volumes are a little pricey, and most people say they can't really afford purchasing all of them, especially because we have about a 25 volume run right now. But everything that we have in our print volumes, we put on our website so that people can access it. So you can access any of the papers that we have in the different series that we have within the Joseph Smith Papers. And we also provide a host of reference tools for people. We have a biographical directory that contains hundreds of people that are mentioned in the Joseph Smith Papers. We also have a glossary to define terms that are used in the Joseph Smith Papers that might be unusual or not familiar to people reading today. We also have a featured topics page, which kind of serves as an index to what is on the website. And we've kind of structured this around what we feel are the most hits that we get on the website. And so one of the primary things that people come to our website for is we have 4 different accounts that Joseph Smith gave of his initial theophany that occurred in 1820. And so a lot of people will come to access those accounts that we have of that. We also have different guides. So we have something like Joseph Smith's correspondence, his letters to his wife Emma, to family members, to church leaders, politicians, attorneys, many others. We have different sermons and teachings that Joseph Smith provided, different organizations that are mentioned, finding aids so that people can easily find the documents related to these things. And so that I think is something that's helpful for the public who are coming to the website, don't really know what to do when they get here. In addition, we've made numerous short videos for people to watch. This is our video page here that just take like a topic that's in one of our print volumes, and they're generally around 2 minutes long, just kind of an explication of that topic. And we find those to be quite popular. And then finally, just last year, we started a podcast with the Joseph Smith Papers. The first topic that we did our podcast on in 2020 was the first vision. And then in January of this year, we did another one called The Priesthood Restored. And we're finding that all of these things are getting used. Just some statistics about this. When we first launched our website in 2011, so about 10 years ago, that year we had 573,892 page views, 104,753 unique visitors. Last year in 2020, we had 2.8 million page views and 664,845 unique visitors. And so far in 2021, just in the 3 months that have passed thus far, we've already had 1.1 million page views and 327,679 unique visitors. Our podcasts, like I mentioned, the First Vision podcast that we did last year, which is available on anywhere that you can access podcasts, had 1.2 million listens as of March 1st of this year. The one that we released this year, the Priesthood Restored one, through the first 2 months of 2021 had 108,000 listens. And so it's clear that our website, these podcasts, these different features that we have on here are being used by the public. And so one of the things that we emphasize to our historians who are working on the project is that it's essential that we engage with the public, whether it's doing, giving talks to interested audiences, whether it's participating in these podcasts, whether it's writing for popular magazines in Utah and elsewhere about the Joseph Smith Papers, because we know that there is an audience for the Joseph Smith Papers that is generally made up of the general public. So much like Gwen mentioned, I definitely would consider documentary editing to be public history.
Thank you, Matt. So we'll continue moving down the list of our presenters, and the next person that we'll hear from is Tyson Reeder. So if you could just go ahead and unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and share your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. It's good to be with everybody. It's great to see so many participants here with us today. I'm grateful for Katie for getting us together here, and grateful for my fellow panelists. And I'm glad to be here with Matt. He gave me my first job in documentary editing. Before I came to the University of Virginia, I was an editor with the papers with the Joseph Smith Papers. Now I am an editor with the Papers of James Madison and an affiliate assistant professor at the University of Virginia. And I did my PhD at UC Davis with Alan Taylor before I jumped to Utah to work on the Joseph Smith Papers, and then came to the University of Virginia. I'm the author of Smugglers, Pirates, and Patriots, Free Trade in the Age of Revolution, and I'm currently writing a history of foreign meddling and foreign collusion in early America through the lens of James Madison. And so as an editor of the papers of James Madison, the papers of James Madison, much like the papers of the Addams Family Papers, it's what we might call sometimes term a legacy project, one of a project that deals with one of the major founding figures in early America. And so there is a lot of correspondence that is preserved. And so these projects are many decades long projects. The Madison Papers, the Papers of James Madison in its current iteration, began in earnest in the 1950s, and we are still not slated to complete our series until about the end of this decade sometime. So it's a massive project. We gather and publish basically everything that came across James Madison's desk. So for a figure like James Madison, you can imagine what some of that correspondence included. So just to give a brief outline, for anybody unfamiliar, Madison, of course, spent time in the 1770s in the Virginia Assembly and the Virginia Governor's Council. He spent time in the Continental Congress and then the Confederation Congress. Of course, now we refer to him as the father of the Constitution. He was then elected to the first Congress of the United States and served in the House of Representatives, was a major figure in the House of Representatives during the 1790s, then became Secretary of State, then became president, then became a retired president to whom many people referred by that time for insight and input about the Constitution, about political crises in the United States and so on. So the correspondence is long, it's unwieldy. My specialty is in early American foreign relations. So I am an editor. I'm focusing specifically on Madison's Secretary of State correspondence. And so that entails receiving correspondence, of course, from all over the world. So we have to deal with correspondence in Italian, in French, in Portuguese, in Spanish, in Dutch. And so it's a massive, massive undertaking. Now, I have to admit, well, first off, let me say I'm on a mission to make James Madison cool, which is a really heavy lift to make James Madison cool. I think it's only slightly easier than making John Adams cool. No offense, Gwen. All right, I kid. All right, well, we can, you can yell at me later. I say that completely in jest. But of course, James Madison is known perhaps for being sort of the boring founder, right? He is, as one of his biographers, Noah Feldman, said, there is a reason that they make musicals of Alexander Hamilton and not of James Madison. But I'm on a mission. I'm on a mission to change that because of the enduring relevance of James Madison to our republic and to our nation. Now, much like James Madison himself, I do admit that the papers of James Madison plays a little bit closer to the vest. We don't have a lot of the same sort of public-facing tools that Matt and Gwen talked about. Now we do have some which I'll share. For instance, all of again what we might call the legacy projects are included on Founders Online. Is that coming through? It's unclear whether that's coming through. Okay, I see a lot of heads nodding. Thank you. So a lot of these projects are included in Founders Online, that you can come see some of the documents that are included here. And this is starting in chronological order, starting from the early 1770s. You can search for different items. And it has a search function, and yet a lot of what we do is in our coordination also with Montpelier, which is the plantation of James Madison. And Montpelier, I will say, has a lot of really great public facing projects and programs that they're doing right now. And the Papers of James Madison is proud to have been a part of that and been able to help with that. Among them, and I'll talk about this more when we get into our second question, is the naming project, where the Montpelier is seeking to identify and find as much information as they can about the enslaved workers and enslaved people on James Madison's plantation. And so there's a lot of really, really great things that can be done that through documentary editing, through making these papers available and making them searchable, and that we can do things with public history that we just couldn't do without such a large corpus of papers.
Thank you, Tyson. I think that's a great point, that, you know, documentary editing is at its heart about making things accessible in a way that I think is very at the core of what a lot of us think about public history in general. For our next presenter, we'll have, just as Tyson said that Matt gave him his first job in documentary editing, our next presenter gave me my first job in documentary editing. So next we have Connie Schultz.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I see a lot of familiar names in the list of those who are participating, and I really appreciate all of you being here. I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm Connie Schultz. I am retired from 25 years of directing the public history program at the University of South Carolina. Have been retired for 13 years from that. I came to public history through the back door, through having been an underemployed historian in the Washington, D.C. area, in which a lot of what I did was with the various institutions in and around Washington, D.C. On a part-time or on a contractual basis. I'm going to just very quickly show a very quick PowerPoint, if I can share my screen. And then I will talk more about editing generally and other projects besides my own. And let's see if I can share my screen. And here's the there we go. Do we have it? No, not wrong one.
Yeah, it's just at the end of the slideshow. So.
Okay. So let's start again. Okay.
Looks perfect.
The reason I wanted to use a slideshow was because I wanted to begin. Let's see, slideshow. No. I knew we would have this. For someone who works in a born digital presentation, okay, from the beginning. There we go.
Oh.
There we go. The first point I wanted to make is that all of us on this session are members of the Association for Documentary Editing, of which I have the honor and the privilege of being the president for this year. And so I wanted to put this up for any of you who don't currently do documentary editing and want to know more about it. The ADE webpage is a really good place to go. It has lots of resources and including a number of things about educational opportunities. And I want to plug that the Association for Documentary Editing has been creating the annual Editing Institute. And this next summer, we hope, cross my fingers, we will be reinstituting that as an online introduction to the skills and the standards of documentary editing. My current position is as a retired member of the history department. I have run two projects. In 2008, we began the papers of Eliza Lucas Pinckney and Harriet Pinckney Oree. And we found doing the women was fascinating. And we did the women first. And then we said, you know, the men that are in their lives are interesting too. Maybe we should look at them. Eliza Lucas Pinckney was an 18th century plantation owner and manager, and her daughter Harriet Pinckney Oree followed in her footsteps. We partner with, for that, Harriet Pinckney Oree's plantation Hampton is now a South Carolina state park, and we partner with them in interpretive ways in many ways. When we began working on the men, we decided that there were many. So the two brothers, move that to that slide. And this is the edition of the papers of Eliza and Harriet. We modeled our edition on a born digital edition of the Dolly Madison papers. And then the papers of the Revolutionary Era statesmen are two brothers, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney on the left of the trio, his younger brother Thomas at the bottom, and their second cousin once removed, Charles Pinckney, who was also a member of the Constitutional Convention. All three of them were governors, members of the House of Representatives and Senate, fought in the Revolutionary War. Charles Cotesworth became a leading general, a partner equal in rank to Hamilton during the Quasi-War of 1798-99. Thomas Pinckney, and this is the volume we're working on right now, became the senior general in the southern half of the US for the War of 1812. All three of them had diplomatic missions. Thomas was minister to England for 4 years in the 1790s. Charles Cotesworth was the leader of the infamous group of American diplomats in what became known as the XYZ affair. And Charles Pinckney switched parties, is known to some of the Pinckney descendants as Black Charlie, because he switched from being a Federalist to being a Republican. And in reward, Thomas Jefferson sent him as a minister to Spain. I wanted to talk a little bit more, almost biographically, in that my experience with editing goes back very early, when in 1973, the Watergate summer, Lewis Harlan invited me to bring my brand new PhD from the University of Cincinnati to work for him at the papers of Booker T. Washington. And I will admit, Lewis was the kind of mentor who said, you know, history is being made, the library will always be here. Let's go to the Senate chambers and watch the Watergate hearings. And so we did. So in a way, editors have been public historians in multiple ways. And I'll talk a little more about the Booker T. Washington papers. I later had an NHPRC fellowship at the First Federal Congress Project, which edited all of the papers of the Congress that made the Constitution into a living governmental institution, the first Congress. And part of that, my job there was to research the 800 plus Revolutionary War veterans who were petitioning the first Congress for something. Usually they were sick and they needed help. They needed the assistance of their country as veterans. When I came to South Carolina, the papers of Henry Laurens, a revolutionary, the first president of the US in the sense that he was president of the Confederation Congress, the only Revolutionary War political leader to be imprisoned in the Tower of London. Henry Laurens, however, was a slave dealer and trader in Charleston. And so his papers became very important as a resource for anybody doing slave studies up until the beginning of the 21st century. And then finally, we began in 2008, and then we worked we have been working on the Pinckney family since 2008. We are supported, and this is important to say, the National Endowment for the Humanities is a major funder for scholarly documentary editing in the United States. Most, maybe not all of us, but many of us on this panel get funding from the NEH. The other major funder are the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, and we need to give them credit. They have had a list of editions that should be done that they drew up in the 1960s. And it's amazing how many are being done. But the bottom line is many, many projects are editing the papers of Americans across the spectrum. There are documentary editions, the Martin Luther King papers, but there's also a documentary edition of Black abolitionists. There are documentary editions that are looking at languages, Native American languages, indigenous languages from New England and from Arizona and New Mexico. So documentary editors have been creating resources to share with public history in a variety of formats. The essential documents for people to get access to the information to inform, to interpret. We give you literal access to the text, but we also give you intellectual access by preparing what editors have sometimes called the value added, the indexes, the editorial notes, the identifications of people, so that if the letter says, please say hello to my mother, if you don't know, we tell you who that person's mother is. At Pinckney Papers, we were one of the early ones that were a born digital project. And it looks like I should stop talking because we have one more person to talk. But in the last 2 decades, more and more editions have been paying attention to the women, the families, the children, the wives, the mothers, the aunts. And all of those are part of this growing body of edited material to which the value of editorial historical insight has been added to give you intellectual as well as physical, literal access to the document. And I'll quit at that and come back later.
Thank you so much. So we will move on to our next presenter, Chuck. If you could go ahead and introduce yourself and give us your own thoughts as well. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Katie, for bringing us all together, and thank you all for joining the 3:30 Eastern slot, the sort of the late slot for me, at least, on a Friday of the second week of a virtual conference, which I think we're all excited to actually sort of be back conferencing again. But we did this alphabetical, but I also think it was probably a good idea from kind of a perspective of public history or digital documentary editing to have everyone else go first, because my project's very different. I'm Chuck Welsko. I run the Civil War Governors of Kentucky Digital Documentary Edition at the Kentucky Historical Society. The newest, and I think kind of the latest project chronologically, we started roughly 2012, and our project is actually kind of a misnomer. There are 5 governors of Kentucky during the Civil War. We use their office as a lens, not really to examine those 5 men. I always joke with people on my team and in the building, the Kentucky Historical Society, that we don't actually really care about those 5 governors. And that sounds kind of cruel, right, when we say it that way. But really what we do is we use their desk as a lens to capture the lives of ordinary Kentuckians in the middle of the Civil War. How did white and black, free and enslaved individuals experience the Civil War, especially in Kentucky, which was a very contested and divided and chaotic border state between Lincoln's election and the end of slavery in Kentucky in 1865. And so part of me wanted to be really contrarian and say, no, documentary editing is not public history, but that would kind of defeat the purpose of us being at NCPH and doing this panel, right? I think unequivocally, right, the work we do is public history work. CWGK, as we call it, it was, like Connie was saying, a born digital project. It was started online. We provide the original document in an image. We provide the transcription. We create these biographies of every individual person, place, and organization mentioned in the documents, and we create a social network, right? Connie had kind of mentioned the idea of like intellectual and physical access, right? The idea that you We provide things for academics. I always like to describe the site as a launching point for discovery, right? You can come in and you can get the documents, but we also kind of from the public history side, right? We have to be the academics to provide the biographies and the interpretation of the edition. But at the same time, right, we're kind of doing outreach and engagement work. CWGK members over the years have built a board game based on farming and agriculture in Civil War Kentucky that's used for teacher resources, right? Teaching packets that instructors can use in middle school and high school and college level to introduce students to these documents and creating activities. We've, with the cooperation of a number of scholars and the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, published a volume, a special edition of 12 essays on Kentucky Civil War history built from the edition. So I think the key to our work being public history, right, is it kind of navigates between this academic world. I have a PhD. I am the only Civil War historian on my project. We have an English student, we have a former English student, a geography PhD, and a medievalist, right? We took these different skills, right, of how to do document editing, but also how to connect it, how to do transcriptions using crowdsourcing platforms from the page. If you need a crowdsourcing platform, right, use from the page, it's great. People can hop in and transcribe documents. We use our connections at a public historic site, right, at the Kentucky Historical Society to create digital exhibits. I'm in the process of creating a physical exhibit out of the documents that we have, or at least proposing one. So yeah, I think that's my short answer. I also realize we have like 50 minutes and we have a whole nother question. And we want to hear from you all, right? Like, I do think the work we do is public history, right? Because it brings in my mind what public history is. It puts the academic work that we do into conversation with the public, and being digital and having all of these other tools and things that we've done, it puts those things out into conversation and creates these points of discovery for academics and the general public. We were talking a little bit before, Gwen had mentioned, right, the research questions or the reference questions that she gets, right? We have those where we have a tab where people will send me questions about family or individuals, and it's another way we get that dialogue going. So that's how I envision the work that I do, and I think documentary editing in general is a good start to connecting academic and kind of public discourses, or at least creating those opportunities. And I'll kick it back to Katie.
Great, thank you, Chuck. Yeah, just one thing also I would add is that in terms of our engagement with public history, documentary editors, our goal isn't just to engage with other documentary editing projects or with just the public, but also with a lot of other, public institutions and museums. I work at the Papers of Martin Van Buren, and Martin Van Buren's home, Lindenwald, is a part of the National Park Service. So part of, their resources that they provide are really helpful for me when Martin is writing about his plans for how to build his house. They have, a Google view that you can see and virtually walk around the house. So I can use that to help me with my transcription. At the same time, we can send letters over to them saying, here's this thing where Martin's talking about who he's hiring and what kinds of goods and shipments he's getting in for his house. And that's something that's really helpful for them as well. So I think that's a really great point, is that, it's a collaborative effort, not just within our own projects, but also within the public history community as well. We do have one more question, and then after that, I'd like to open it up for maybe further audience discussion. So with our second question, I'd ask that our collection of speakers keep it to around 4 minutes each. That way we can have plenty of time at the end for the rest of our audience to respond and talk to us. So our second question is, how can documentary editing projects incorporate the perspectives and the untold stories of underrepresented groups, and also to help diverse publics explore their history, right? That's the theme of what our conference has been about this year. So we'd like to take that idea and turn it towards the lens of documentary editing. So again, if we could start with Gwen, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Katie. I think there are several ways that we do this. Obviously, because we're documentary editors, the primary way is through the volumes themselves and the editorial choices we make. And the very first editorial choice you make is selection. I think Chuck put it brilliantly about how we use these really public figures as a lens and we look at the common man around them. So John Adams, especially when he's vice president, when he's president, he gets inundated with mail from his fellow man. There are artists looking for patronage. There are inventors who want patents. Everybody in the world wants a job. And what's really interesting about these letters is that these people, it's like a job interview. I mean, they're really pleading their case to John, so they tell him their whole life story. And very often these people are immigrants, recent immigrants to the country. We had one gentleman who came from what is now Italy, and he spelled everything phonetically. And we had no idea what he was talking about until you sounded out the words. Then you're like, oh, this is an Italian accent. He's saying Wednesday. So you definitely do get, I mean, people will say, I was born here, I moved here, I got married here. Like they're saying, please give me a job so I can feed my family. And they're giving us so much information about what life was like at that time and the immigrant experience in the early American Republic. So while we don't want to publish every single one of those letters, because I mean, that's a whole different series. But we certainly, if a member of an underrepresented group is writing the letter, that's almost a shoo-in, because one of our criteria for selection is we're looking for rarity. So if there's somebody from somewhere really cool or has like a very a background that's not Boston, then we're certainly very interested in them. Any mention of an underrepresented group, like for example, John Quincy might say, I went to see President Washington, there were some chiefs there, and he might leave it at that. So then it's up to us in our annotation to figure out who actually was there. And very often we will pair that with our choice of illustrations for the volume. And each of our illustrations gets an essay to accompany it in the front matter, where we would really be able to flesh out those stories more and give them a little bit of a focus. We talk about how the Adamses know them, and then we tell you their story, and also the story of the artist, which is how we incorporate more people. The Adams editors really take exquisite care in identifying people, like exquisite care. They want to identify every greengrocer, bookseller, farmhand, servant, the little old ladies who go to Abigail's church. I mean, anyone who otherwise would slip through the cracks. We really try to identify them, get a birth, death, who they are, what they did. And we've especially been thinking about the questions that Katie poses when it comes to indexing for two reasons. One is that it's the first place people usually go in a documentary edition. It's rare that somebody's fanatical enough about the Adamses to want to just sit cover to cover. But most people aren't like that. And the other reason is that that is where we give the individuals in our volume an identifying label. And we're trying to boil down their life to 2 or 3 words. You know, this man is a Boston merchant. So our aim is to ensure that the identifier is accurate above all else, meets the best practices, and preserves the dignity of the individual. So we have to constantly reassess, especially when it comes to enslaved people or indigenous people. We want to make sure, because that's an ever-evolving process, and we want to make sure that what we're doing is respectful. So for the current volumes we're working on and upcoming volumes, we have been consulting with Native scholars, and we're really trying to keep abreast of linguistic shifts when it comes to talking about enslaved people. Another way we do it outside of the volumes is we have the Beehive, which is Massachusetts Historical Society's blog. And that's really cool because you get to take these tidbits of information from across the volumes and put them all together to create a cohesive story. So for example, this week I wrote a blog post about the Adamses' servants. They had 6 servants marry each other in a very short period of time, which Abigail was writing about. Abigail usually won't write a full letter about her servants unless one of them has a child out of wedlock, Esther. She managed to keep that a secret her whole life, and then some snot-nosed little editor lets it out of the bag at a conference. But unless it's something huge like that, that is really stressing Abigail out, it tends to be a sentence or 2. So the blog posts allow us to take those sentences or 2, and after 15 years of sentences or 2, it really adds up, and you can create a full picture of someone. So Rebecca Dexter is no longer a footnote, she's really flesh and blood. And to answer your question about how we can help diverse publics explore their own history, I think the most important things we can do is index really well and make our editions free and publicly available through our digital edition to allow scholars who have a really specialized knowledge of that for it to aid them in their research so that we can constantly have new scholarship and we can constantly have these discussions. So I think that's the best way to go about that.
Thank you so much, Gwen. We'll move on to Matt.
All right, I will apologize in advance. My internet completely went out about 20 minutes ago, so I am on my phone's hotspot right now. So I hope this all works and I don't drop off. But I love this question because for the Joseph Smith papers, this is a question we wrestle with every day, because this is a project about a white male in a church that was overwhelmingly white, in a church where at the time of Joseph Smith's life, women didn't really have much of a role in it. So there aren't a lot of diverse voices in the documents that we are producing or that we are annotating in the Joseph Smith papers. So as we have discussed this as a team and have kind of worked on this over a period of several years, some of the things that we've come up with aren't that dissimilar from what Gwen was talking about. We really try to look for ways in our annotation to find and highlight different voices and diverse groups. And although there aren't thousands of mentions, you can find diverse people and diverse voices in Joseph Smith's documents if you look hard enough. And so as we're going through, we really try to make a conscious effort to highlight some of these voices. Just as a couple of examples of this, I was working on a document. It was minutes of a meeting that was held in Kirtland, Ohio, of several of the church's elders. And in this meeting, they have some people who have come from New York to Kirtland, and they have about $800 that their branch has donated that they want to give to Joseph Smith to help build up the church. And as you're going through these minutes, nothing too remarkable until you realize that at some point in the meeting, they figure out that of this $800, $150 had been contributed by a woman named Caroline Lewis. And so we dug deep to try to figure out who Caroline Lewis was. And it turns out she was a 22-year-old single woman from New York. We don't know a lot about her. We don't know how she had the $150 to contribute. But we were able to find some information about her. We know that after she donated the money, the following year she got married, and then she died the year after that in childbirth. And so we were able to kind of highlight some aspects of her life in our annotation to those minutes. There was another document that we worked on that was a very brief pay order that Joseph Smith produced in Illinois in 1842. And it just said, talking to one of the bishops of the church who was over kind of the church's financial affairs, it just said, please give Mrs. Young anything she might want from your store. And that's pretty much all that the document said. But we were able to, again, kind of dig deeper into that. We've figured out that Mrs. Young was Mary Ann Angel Young, who is the wife of Brigham Young, another prominent member of the church. And he was overseas preaching in England at the time. And she was in Nauvoo, Illinois, back with the body of the church. The church was supposed to be taking care of her, but she was quite impoverished at the time. And we were able to kind of take her story and write an article about her and about kind of the plight of many of these missionary wives during this time, whose husbands were off preaching. They were left at home with the children trying to take care of their house, and most of them were impoverished, just didn't have a lot of money. So we look for stories like this, for voices like that, that we can then either annotate, write some of these spin-off articles about. Several of the videos that that I showed earlier focus on things such as Emma Smith and her correspondence with the governor of Illinois when the state of Missouri was trying to get Joseph Smith extradited from Illinois to Missouri. We have lesson plans that we've created. One of these lesson plans deals with Joseph Smith and Indigenous people. And we try to highlight the documents that show his interactions with the Indigenous tribes of Illinois and some of his teachings about Native American groups as well. And so I think it's really a matter for our project of just really kind of being focused on trying to give voice to diverse groups, even if they don't appear that much in the documents. We try to highlight them as much as we can.
Thank you. Just in the interest of time, we will continue moving. Our next speaker is Tyson. If you could share your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll be very brief to make sure we leave plenty of time. Let me share my screen quickly, which looks like it will be this one. Okay. So I mentioned this earlier, in the naming project of Montpelier. Now this we are not coordinating with Montpelier on. This is all Montpelier. I'm not trying to take credit for their really, really great work here. But I just want to show this as an example of what we can learn about people we never know about without this corpus of correspondence being made available. So for those enslaved people whom we know enough about to create, some sort of biography, you can come on this website at Montpelier's naming project, and I just chose Harry as an example, and they've made some of these images available. Harry was a coachman for James Madison. There's a few things we know about him. He seems to have been about an average height because he wears size 7 shoe, which is pretty average on this list of shoes for enslaved people at Montpelier. But what's really fascinating is when we get in here, and these are images taken from the Library of Congress, but they're available in the papers of James Madison. Is this image that you're looking at recounts an experience of Harry driving Madison up to Congress on his way to the first Congress after the ratification of the Constitution, and he drops Madison off at Mount Vernon. Harry stays the night at Mount Vernon, gets his rest, the horses rest. Madison continues on to New York, either by public stage or in a carriage of one of his colleagues who was also meeting at Mount Vernon. And then Harry takes the team of horses and the coach back to Montpelier on his own. And so this raises all sorts of questions. And this, I want to bring Harry up because it sort of helps us get at sort of the frustration that we can feel when we're trying to learn about some of these underrepresented voices, but also, that we do have, because of these papers, the ability to ask questions that we wouldn't have known to ask otherwise. What sort of relationship, personal connection and relationship did Madison and Harry have that Madison trusts Harry to return to Montpelier on his own? Madison at the time had experiences with several runaway slaves. Madison knew of Harry's intelligence. And yet he trusts Harry not only to not run away, or maybe he doesn't trust him, but hopes that there's enough. Is it that he does trust him, or is it that there is he thinks that there may be just enough enough social checks in place that Harry won't run away, enough social and legal checks in place that Harry won't risk running away. These are, in some ways, these things give us more questions than answers. But again, they're questions we wouldn't know to ask. What went through Harry's mind? He just spent the night with George Washington, who in a couple of months was going to receive an overwhelming welcome from New Yorkers. And yet Harry probably had more intimate interaction with many of the New Yorkers who were able to vote and had more of a participation in the new American democracy than Harry did, despite his closeness to some of these major figures. So what did Harry make of that dynamic? Again, questions that are intriguing, tantalizing, that we'll probably never know the answers to, but through the availability of some of these documents, we know to ask the questions and can at least get glimpses into some of these people. And I'll end there to make sure that we keep on time.
Thank you. And that certainly sounds like an interesting project. I'm sure everyone will be interested in checking it out, the URL, later after the conference. For our next speaker, Connie, if you could unmute yourself and give us your thoughts.
When what you're editing are the papers of white, wealthy, Southern male slaveholders, that's the elephant in the room. And I'm sure Tyson has experienced that. Chuck, I think probably some of your issues have to do with that. Because we were born digital and there were no, what sometimes editors call the limits of the real estate on the page, we have been able to, as we go through our documents, and from the beginning with the Eliza Pinckney Harriet Oree edition, anytime an enslaved person was named by name, we created a unique, we call it a glossary, but it's basically a list of every person, every place, everything, name of a book, etc., name of an organization. That is our ID list. And so we've created an ID for every unique name, including all the enslaved people. And when you consider that we're dealing with 3 generations basically during the time period we're looking at from 1760 to 1840, they own multiple plantations. They are moving families from here to there. They are trading them. They are inheriting them or passing them on in wills. They buy other plantations and disperse and many of those documents name all of the slaves. They often name them within the context of a set of family relations, sometimes by their placement on the page in the inventory, sometimes by the description of the relationship. This is Sam, and Sam is the son of Eno. We now have a project going forward that one of our graduate assistants is working on, where we are moving them out of the documents and into an Excel spreadsheet, which we will then, we hope, she's already working on this, be able to share with a larger sort of peer-reviewed source called enslaved.org. And our database of enslaved people, which now has probably close to 1,000 names on it, or 1,000 individuals, many with shared names, will become part of a larger resource that will be shared through enslaved.org for anybody doing research on enslaved people. Now, that's difficult to get out there because every single document in which that name appears, we can link you to it. Often it's no more than that they were sold, but they were sold. Joe is a driver. His wife's name was, their 3 children are, and sometimes what their role is. We are working with people who say, but the name of the person can sometimes give you insight into their African ethnic heritage. because certain names come from certain language forms within the African diaspora. So we hope that even though, yes, we are editing the papers of very rich, unapologetically slaveholding white men and women, that we are being able to provide some resources for bringing people into the world of knowledge. And that doesn't even mention all of the ordinary soldiers that are named in the documents when Thomas and Charles Coatsworth are officers in the Revolution, or increasingly now as they in the officers of the senior general in the War of 1812, overseeing troops by name. Ordinary people show up in these documents across the board. They began doing so when I worked for the Booker T. Washington papers, and my job was all of the poor Black local people who wrote to Booker T. Washington asking him to help them. And my job was to go into the Library of Congress stacks, back when you could, and to go through city directories to figure out who are these people who are writing, freed men and women in the South writing to Booker T. Washington. So not just my project, but going back to document projects that didn't have some of the awareness we now have. The resources are there to recapture some of them in ways that documentary editing will continue to make possible.
Thank you. And of course, we hope we can make these sorts of things possible for in the future for decades to come, of course, and, you know, always expand on the ways in which we can incorporate diverse perspectives. Last but certainly not least, we have Chuck.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. I think the key here, right, this is the question that CWGK lives for, or was born for, right? The project, again, we used the name of the governors to kind of give the frame to the project and the chronology to the project, but really we began, and I'm using this kind of imperial we, right? I wasn't here like 8 years ago when the project started, but CWGK, right, really began with the attempt to correct kind of the post-war narrative of Kentucky, right, which is pretty much too white and too Confederate, right? The idea that it was a Confederate state kind of emerges after the war, right? And CWGK kind of came around to push this dominant Union narrative. It's certainly a Unionist narrative that is entwined with slavery, right? They're fighting for the Union and the preservation of slavery. But from that, right, kind of from that guiding philosophy to kind of recorrect the narrative of Civil War Kentucky, we, like Connie was mentioning, annotate biographies for every person, place, and organization. So that includes, right, Connie kind of called it an index or a list, right, of names. We set up standardized policies, so every person that's met gets the same kind of care and research. And this could literally be like an unknown name, right? They're a slave that's mentioned in a document. And we'll still dive into them and try and provide as much research as we can. And we found some gems, right? We are limited very much, I think, as everyone else. Tyson, you mentioned frustration, right? Like we are bound by this frustration. The frustration of people who wrote to the governors in the 19th century were predominantly white males. The collective practices of 150 years, or like the immediate post-war aftermath, right, was very much geared towards, right, white wealthy plantation owners, white wealthy politicians and individuals. But we've still captured some names, right? One of CWGK's best stories is of Caroline Dement, an enslaved Tennessean who flees to Louisville with Don Carlos Buell's army, gets arrested, stuck in a family to take care of a child until her owner could return to her. The child dies from poisoning. Caroline's accused of this crime, but eventually a bunch of white Louisvillians rally to her cause. We've turned this into videos, and we've turned this into a digital exhibit online, right? That we have a letter from Caroline, right? We've actually been able to capture her voice, probably dictated to someone else, but it's at least her words. And recently, one of my colleagues found an allusion to African Americans escaping, but they're only referenced as slaves. And we were able to figure out by creating a series of linked biographies who these people are. And they're very short biographies, but it's kind of that attempt, right, to do the work and really to start bringing these lives out as best we can. Whenever we find them, identify them, provide some information. Hopefully, as we go through more of these documents, we'll find more enslaved individuals, show their agency, their attempts to escape, or their attempts to at least have some influence over their own lives. Hopefully, eventually, right, dealing more and more with places like Camp Nelson, where United States colored troops are organized and fight in the Union, fight for their freedom. So we provide that avenue. And I'd be remiss trying to keep us with a little bit of time, right? CWGK is inspired, or is part of a consortium of several other documentary editions, one in Mississippi that's starting under Susanna Urel, and another one at the University of Alabama with Leslie Gordon and Julia Brock. So right, those are actually going to go even further, carrying into Reconstruction. And I'm very jealous of all of the awesome work that all three projects get to do. But I wanted to give them a little bit of shout out, right? Like how this one project started in 2012 has now spun 2 extras. And right, one of you had mentioned you wanted to make Madison cool. I think Tyson, right? My goal is to make sure that every single like state that existed in 1860 in the Civil War has a Civil War Governor's Project at some point. That's my slowly low ambitious goal, right? But yeah, I think, again, CWGK lives for this type of work. And I think it's really what's guiding us into those next documents and into the next couple of years as we look to expand that work.
Thank you. So we have about 20 minutes left or so. I'd welcome any kinds of questions, whether you use the raise your hand feature and then we can call on you, or I'm happy to just read questions out of the chat as well. So we actually do have one question here in the chat already from a member of our audience. The question is, have you been able to find stories of persons with disabilities? I can go first with that. I work at the Papers of Martin Van Buren, as I've mentioned before. And within the Papers of Martin Van Buren, he is the president, he is the Secretary of State, but he's also the son, he's not the son, but he's the father of 2 sons that in one way or another become disabled throughout the course of their lives. His 3rd son, Martin Van Buren Jr., got TB when he was very young, and it was actually what Martin's wife died of. And throughout the rest of his life, Martin Jr. was very, very sickly. He never married. He always stayed and lived with Martin, and Martin would take care of him. But he also had he found a way to have a very rich and active life when he was not, in a particularly severe stage of his disease. So he was the private secretary to his father. So we see a lot of correspondence that is signed by Martin, but is actually written by his son. We also find a lot of correspondence with President Van Buren, talking to different people to see if doctors can be brought in to look after his son. They'll travel to different hot springs in the Virginia and Maryland area that are, supposed to have healing properties. They eventually travel to Europe, where his son unfortunately passes away, because they are there to seek out special doctors for his son. And in the same course, one of Martin's other sons, Abraham, is a soldier in the Mexican-American War, and he's wounded at a battle, and it severely limits his mobility from there on out. So we also have a lot of interesting letters that we're going through right now, finding out what the extent of that disability is, and seeing what kind of improvements and changes they made to the house in order to better accommodate both the sons and their disabilities. If anyone else would like to add, or any perspectives you may have from your projects, or anyone else, feel free to ask questions as well.
I would have to go through we have a document log, which has recorded all of our about 15,000 and counting documents. And we put notes in the doc log about the document as we're working with it. And I recall that a number of the things about enslaved people will often note if they have been injured, if they have, often the slave rosters will mention that so-and-so can no longer work because. So we have some information about people who are unable to perform the tasks that the masters are expecting them to. We also have a number of financial records in the sense of little slips of paper like you bring home from the grocery store and file away in an envelope. But for the Pinckneys, the household receipts often mention the purchase of something to help cure one of the enslaved people. They do for those that are in their actual household. They do call in doctors, they buy pharmaceuticals, they manufacture. One of the more interesting documents in the Pinckney Ori edition is we have two receipt books, one of Eliza and one of Harriet, in which they describe the medicinal things that they concoct. And then they describe using them in maintaining the health of their enslaved laborers. And that's a little off the track of disabilities, but we do, one of the interesting things in this enslaved inventory records is it often will describe the disabilities or the injuries that prevent work of the enslaved labor force. That's a little off of your question, but.
I'd follow up with that and just say, so one of the things that we know is Madison valued Harry at $600, right? And so this is a major question when you start to talk about slavery, is when the person who has enslaved you only values you in terms of your monetary value, what happens when you become disabled or sick? And I'm on a mission. I am on a mission to make Madison cool, but there are times when he is very uncool, and some of those times are when it comes to he has a slave who he was particularly frustrated with. He thought that he was lying to him and thought that he was helping, like covering for another slave who had escaped and so on. That slave falls sick. And just the letters that he was writing, that just the sort of callous nature as the slave is seems to be nearing his death, that Madison is writing about is sick, that it's just, he's just sort of reporting the news. There's no feeling behind it. Certainly no sense of personal loss for Madison. At another point, he writes home to say to his father to say, well, you can tell Anthony and Betty that their son Billy died. And there's just sort of a callousness behind that. And so that there is, I know that's not, again, that is also off the topic of disability a little bit, but it does speak to this broader issue of what happens for slaves when their masters have, consider them no longer as monetarily valuable as they once were. It makes life that much harder for a slave.
Is there any other questions from the chat? We have love to hear from anyone in the audience. I'd say in the meantime that, a lot of our projects, although they, as we've mentioned, they're focused on one person, it's also sometimes somewhat surprising what we find within those collections and what's included. For example, as President Martin Van Buren was for some reason or another also at least nominally in charge of the prisons within the Washington, D.C. area. So he would sometimes get reports that would be then sent on to Congress with who has been arrested, what they were arrested for, what jobs they now are supposed to do within the prison, how much they're paid for them. Even looking at things like sentencing, there's a lot of really interesting things that in reality have very little to do with the person whose name is on the project. That can give us a really good lens into looking at all people from all different kinds of walks of life during the historical periods that we study. Yeah, yes, Connie.
I just got my latest issue of the Public Historian, and the Public Historian's issue is focused on girlhood. And it uses as its cover image American Girl dolls, which to talk about sort of the misrepresentation or the representation and sometimes misrepresentation of American girlhood over time, beginning with the iconic American Girl dolls for the Revolutionary War period. So I'm sure Gwen can talk to this also, because most of the study of children has focused on using a disparate number of sources. But because we are editing at the Pinckney Papers all of the family, we do have some documents by the children. We have a wonderful travel diary document that Thomas Pinckney's younger daughter traveled north with him in 1816 after the War of 1812 was over. And she describes as she's at that point 16. So not a really young child, but and so we can provide documentation about some of the thoughts of younger people that underrepresented people include children, girls as well as boys. The very early experience, Thomas Pinckney and his wife went to England as minister to England in 1792, and they took with them 6 children ranging in age from 3 to 10 years old. Well, the Adams Papers had that same experience. What happens when children, as very young children, are taken abroad? How are they educated? And I know the Adams Papers had a whole volume, and I think there's a recent book out on the Adamses abroad, Adam families abroad. So these documentary editions have windows into people that we don't think of historically, but which, if you have an historic house, if you are trying to create an exhibit, you can get some insights into little people as well as into big people.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about there's a letter from Martin that one of his sons then decides to practice his own signature on. So you just see these little John Van Burens over and over again on the back, which is just very, very cute. We have another question from our audience. Which says, when you're putting the editions online, how do you work with your audiences and their expectations or behaviors into the way that the site is built? The Joseph Smith Papers has the glossary and other short biographies. What other ways do you provide additional ways in which to access, for your publics to access your editions and their documents? Chuck?
Yeah, I was going to say that actually is a good question, timely for me, right? Connie had mentioned the enslaved.org folks earlier. I've been doing a professional development workshop with them through the Omohundro Institute at William and Mary on Monday mornings. It's a great site, but it got me, a lot of the conversations we had got me thinking about how CWGK works, right? And I think, especially for a digital project, it's kind of this idea of, at least for me, right? I've inherited it from several previous directors. So this kind of constantly re-engaging your audience, right? Like we have our editorial policy that we always have draft stamped at the top, right? Because we're always kind of adapting, right? We come across a new situation. How would we handle this situation? How would, from the earlier question, right? How would we handle someone with disabilities or mental health issues? So part of it's always kind of keeping things going. I'm going through kind of a website revamp right now, or at least some parts of the website, adding in a section on controlled vocabulary, how to use, I think I mentioned earlier, and I think a couple other people, Gwen had mentioned the reference question section. We have a tab on like all of the documents where people can submit queries to us. So both kind of keeping windows or avenues to be engaged with the public. I've also been, like I said, trying to institute a transcription platform, kind of posted on a separate site, but having a get involved page on our website of ways that people can get involved. And then also finding ways to engage with different people, right? That button is a good place, but also when we had people pre-COVID, right, coming into KHS being like, hey, here's our site, do you like it? What don't you like about it? And engaging academics and trying to, right, constantly be listening to what people are saying and realizing that some things are set in stone, but there's always some things that you can adjust and adapt to.
I just echo what Chuck's saying there, that, you know, when we first put the Joseph Smith Papers website online in 2011, it looked much different than it does today. So it's developed over time as we've kind of listened to what people have to say about it. And also, as you know, we have a product manager who tracks, you know, who's looking at what on the site. And so he kind of knows what things are getting hits, what types of things aren't getting hits, and we can adjust based on that. And I know that just getting feedback and having open dialogue with academics, with the public about what's useful on the site has been great for us. Our search function used to be terrible on the Joseph Smith Papers site, and we got a lot of feedback about that, and we're able to adjust it, and it's better now than what it was, and we hope to make it even better in the future.
Well, to a certain extent, what access we can give, I mean, we try to give intellectual access by providing these value-added, you know, we too have short biographies of absolutely everything. Hello, Remy. I now have a dog. My sister's dog has arrived to greet me. The bottom line is that we all are limited to a certain degree by the publication system in which we live. We can provide additional ways through external things, through blogs, but every time you, as an editor, prepare a blog, that's time that you aren't spending editing the documents that your funders expect you to finish editing by the time that your funding runs out. To bring some, the reality is we work within bureaucratic institutions, which limit, for instance, we are not able to create our own website without going out and doing web design and purchasing a web URL for ourselves. We have to work within the university's web system. Hate the one that they have. Our project web design and our project website is pretty poor. We try to work around those things to do some other things through partnerships, as Chuck has talked, with other institutions. So we have a good relationship. Charles Pinckney's home site, Snee Farm, is now a National Park historic site. So we get word out through their website and through the public programming that they do. We hope that enslave.org is going to be a real way of getting our materials out. But we work, as many of the rest of you do, within bureaucratic institutions that it sometimes takes some very creative thinking to get around the limitations that they put in our way. I wanted to briefly mention that one of the things on the reaching out to underrepresented members of the community, we in the editing field, like most of public history, have a real need to reach out to draw people into the field as participating editors who represent some of these underrepresented communities. Right now I have 2 young undergraduate African-American editorial assistants, but they're graduating. How do I recruit more people of color people of Hispanic or Latinx backgrounds to begin to understand that here is an area where they can participate as historians in sharing the wealth of documents with the rest of the world. We as an editorial community have the same problems that the larger public history community has in terms of recruiting underrepresented staff into the projects and the work that we do. And I'm taking too much time.
Well, I think that's definitely an important point to add, Connie. So I thank you for making it. We do perhaps have time for one more question, but we are very close to the end of our session. So not seeing any more popping up. I would encourage anyone in our audience who is more interested in documentary editing to either reach out to one of our speakers or to look at the ADE, Association for Documentary Editing website to find out more if maybe you want to get involved in something like a project or something like that. Grant opportunities are always available. I'd really like to thank everyone for coming to view our session and to share your thoughts, and also to my co-presenters as well. Thank you all for agreeing to be on this virtual roundtable, as it were. So I'd like to thank everyone for spending their time this, lovely afternoon Friday, and otherwise I'd say we can all meet in the bar afterwards, but I guess we'll have to do it on our own time. But thank you very much to everyone for joining for this session.
Next year in Montreal.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.